In this video, I'm going to teach you everything that you need to know about using Storybook in your React applications. So Storybook is a front-end workshop designed for building UI components and pages in isolation separate from your project. It is used by thousands of developer teams all across the world for things like UI development, testing, and even documentation. So learning Storybook is a very useful tool to have as a React developer. But before we get into that, if you want to learn how to build a big and complex application with React as a total beginner with no prior experience, check out Project React in the description. It is a course that is literally going to teach you everything about building big and complex applications with React. And again, you don't need any prior experience. Check it out. It'll be the first thing in the description. I promise you, you will not regret it. Let's get into it. All right, so let's begin. As usual, I have a very simple application up and running, which you can find on GitHub. I've created a repository for it. It'll be linked somewhere in the description. This is a very simple application that we're going to use to set up and run Storybook in our application. So currently what we have here, the only things that we're concerned about in this application are these two components over here, the button component and the stack component. These components are UI components. They're super simple. This one just renders an HTML button, as you can see over here, and then has a few props to determine what style the button should have. The stack component is also a UI component, and this one is in charge of rendering a stack of different items, so multiple items. It takes here a children property, which are the items that is supposed to render inside of a stack, and then it also takes in an orientation. Is it horizontal or is it vertical? And based off of that, we set the correct styles over here, and then we just render a div with those styles, and then we pass the children inside of it, right? So these are two very simple components, and now we're going to run Storybook to actually run these components in isolation. That means separate from our actual project, to be able to play around with this and see how these components behave. Because that's what Storybook does. So the whole point of Storybook, if we go here to the actual UI, the actual website of Storybook, is to build UIs without the grunt work. It is a tool. It is a workshop tool for frontend for building UI components, right? Like these components over here, like the button and the stack, in isolation, separate from the project, so that you don't have to deal with all of the code in the project, right? Maybe in your actual project, seeing a button or seeing a stack component requires you to have a screen set up, requires you to have navigation set up, only to see if your stack behaves exactly as you expect it to. With Storybook, you're going to be able to run this exact component and any component that you want in your application in isolation without any of the other things, so that you can see and make sure that the stack component behaves exactly as you expect it to, and more importantly, so that everyone else on your team can actually see how this component behaves, right? This is also useful for documentation, where if somebody hasn't worked on a stack component before, can just go and look up its properties in an actual environment and play around with it, and then be able to use it in some other place in the application for their own development, right? And that's a very important distinction to make. Storybook is not something that you add inside of a project, even though you're going to install it as a dependency and it is literally going to go inside of it, but it's rather something that you add alongside your project. You're actually spinning up a new application that is separate from your project to run individual components within that, again, to not be bothered by the existing code of the application, to have a separate clean environment just for those UI components. Cool. So now that we understand that and we understand what Storybook is, let's actually get started and start installing it into our project. Because what we're essentially going to do is we're going to take both of these components here and I'm going to run them in isolation and see how they behave without ever actually having to run our existing project. So we're going to come here, we clicked get started. It takes us to the documentation here and we have get started with Storybook. In here, I want you to scroll down to where you have these buttons over here. And now depending on the actual framework and tool that you're using, you're most likely going to have an option here. If you're using Next.js, click on this one. If you're using React with Vite, click on this one. This is what we're going to be using. Obviously, if you're using Vue or something else, click those. But for now, we're going to go into React and Vite and start the documentation. Then we're going to come here. We're going to scroll down to getting started. And then we're going to run this over here in a project without Storybook. So our project right now currently doesn't have Storybook. And actually, I should make this a little bit bigger. I just noticed. There we go. Our project is a clean project. It doesn't have anything besides these two components over here. And of course, all of the code required to actually set up and run an application with Vite. So what we're going to do is take this command and we're going to run it inside of our project. So we're going to open up here the terminal and we're going to paste npx storybook at latest and then init. This is going to ask us to install Storybook. We're going to press Y to accept this and then press enter. And now it's going to actually set up and put everything together that is needed to actually inject and set up Storybook inside of our project. Now, once the command finishes installing all of the dependencies and getting everything ready, it's actually actually going to go and start the Storybook application directly for you, and you can see it over here. Let me just open a new tab. In my case, it opened it in a different browser, so I'm just reopening it here. But this is what you're seeing. Meet your new front-end workshop, development, testing, and documentation. And we're going to press this. This, by the way, let me just show you. So this, first of all, is the actual UI. You can have a little tutorial over here if you want to. We're not going to do that just because I'm going to explain everything else to you regardless. But this over here is what Storybook actually looks like. And the reason we have all of these things over here, like this button and all of these different things here, is because Storybook, when it ran that command, it actually added over here, if I can find it, first of all, it added this folder, this .storybook folder, which has a main.ts and then a preview.ts. You can actually go and change these files to add configurations to Storybook. We're not going to do that. But here inside of SRC, we have components here, and then we have stories. All of this has been added directly by Storybook. And here you can see we have some CSS files. We have button.css. We have button.stories.ts. If I open up this file, this is actually the file that is running the story of the button. We have the button over here. We have docs, right? Documentation for the button, all of its props. We have different stories over here, primary, secondary, large, and small. All of those are coming directly from this .stories file. And then we have other files here. We have some for the header and stuff like that, right? These are all here. We have the header and then we have the page, right? So that is how this works, right? So Storybook is essentially, like I said, an application that you run, and then you can have components in isolation over here, right? We're not running our existing project. We're running the Storybook application, and we can see the buttons inside of here, and we can actually interact with them and see how they look like with different props, right? So that's how you want to use Storybook. Now, this obviously is all set up for us, so that's not really fun. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come in here, and actually I'm going to take all of this code here, and I'm just going to delete it, and we're going to start fresh because we don't want its existing code. We want to start fresh and use our own custom components to actually build them inside of Storybook. Now, of course, as soon as we did that, as soon as we removed every single file in our stories folder, we're going to see an error here that we couldn't find a story matching ID, right? Because the URL is over here. If we just change the URL to just localhost 6006, which is the default port of Storybook, it's going to say that we couldn't find any stories in your Storybook. Of course, you can't find any stories because we just deleted all of them. So now it's on us to recreate stories for the button component and from the stack component, and see how you would do this from scratch, from the ground up, to actually get set up to be able to use this in your own React applications. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to work on the button component, right? So this, we have a button component. We have some props here. We have onClick, which is an optional function. We have a variant, which can either be of type primary or of secondary. Both of those are strings. And we have the size as well, which can be small, medium, large as well. This component also takes in props with children, right? That's why we did this props with children here. We have children, which we're going to use to actually render out the contents of the button, right? So that's very important. And here, don't worry too much about this. This is just how we're using the actual props to determine some styles to then apply them directly to the button, right? So we're going to run now this button in Storybook, allow us to configure it, set different props, and then see how this button looks like in isolation. So the first thing that we want to do is come here inside of our stories folder where we just deleted everything, and then we'll create our first story. So we're going to do button.stories.ts. And this is very important. You have to put .stories because this is how Storybook knows that this is a story file, and it's then going to run it and actually spin it up in the actual UI. Now, in this file, the first thing that we want to do, because we're going to be working with our button component, is we want to import the button component to actually use it in this file. So we're going to do import and then button from components at button. There we go. We're just going to import this. Again, we're going to use it in just a moment. Then we're going to come here, make a new line. And because we are working in TypeScript, we're going to first start defining our types for our actual story inside of this file. So we're going to do type story props, and that's going to be equal to, we're going to do component props. We're going to import this from React, and then we're going to pass it here type of button. So what this is going to do is this is going to create a type over here called story props, which is going to be all of the props of our button component. That's what this component props does. It takes all of the props of whatever you give it, and then it just returns you those props. So story props is going to have onClick, variant size, and it's also going to have children, which are all the props of this button component. And the reason we're creating this is because inside of our story, we're going to allow every single one of those props to be configured configurable to be changeable so that we can see how our button behaves when its props are different, right? That's the reason why we're doing this. And then we're going to come here, make a new line, and now we're going to be creating a meta object that is going to have all of the different properties and set up configuration variables for our story of our button. So we're going to do const meta. That is going to be meta, which we are going to import. Let's see here from, it is Storybook at React. It's not showing up here, but I can manually import it. So we're going to do import meta and then from Storybook and then here at React. There we go. So that is going to be meta. And then we're going to pass it your story props like so, and that is going to be equal to an object like this. And then because this, every time that I save, it's automatically adding this export default because it knows that in this file we need to be exporting a default. So what we're going to do is export default meta like this, and now we have no longer problems. If you're curious, we have an error over here that is saying that this file should have at least one story export. This is coming directly from Storybook, which actually went into our ESLint that was available in this project. If I go here, ESLint, and it added over here, as you can see, it added some plugins for Storybook, the recommended plugins from Storybook. So it knows that this is a stories file and that this should have certain rules. You have to export a default meta object, which now we have, so it's no longer complaining about it, and that we have to export at least one story, which we currently don't have. So that's why this is complaining, right? This makes sense. Now, inside of our meta object, we're going to give it here the component, which is going to be our button component, right? So this is going to be the component that we're actually testing and running the Storybook on, right? And we're going to do this exact same thing for the stack component, just in a different file, right? So that all of these configuration files are only related to the actual component that we're using inside of this file. In our case, the button. Okay, so now we're going to have to create our first story. So first, to be able to do that, let's look at our component, our button component, and let's think about what makes sense for us to do as a first story for this component, right? So we have this onClick function here. We're not really concerned about that initially, but then we have this variant property over here, which can be of type primary or of type secondary. So it would make sense for us to have two different stories for this button component, one that has primary set up as a variant, and then one that has secondary set up as a variant. Because as you can see here, based on the variant, we have this variant styles option over here. If it is primary, our background color is going to be blue. If it is secondary, it is going to be gray, right? And using those different stories, we're going to be able to visually see and make sure that when this is primary in this button, the button is going to be blue, and when it's secondary, it is going to be gray. So let's start with that. Then we're going to come back here to our button.stories file. And first, what we're going to do before creating any single individual story is we're going to have to create another type, which is going to be the type of an individual story. So that is going to be type story like this, and that is going to be equal story object. We're going to import this from Storybook at React, and then we're going to pass it story props like this with the correct spelling, right? Which is coming directly from our type over here, right? So each individual story is going to have this type over here, which is going to come from story props, which is going to be the actual component props of our actual button, and everything gets stored inside of this story object. Don't worry if you don't fully understand this. Realistically, what you're going to do is do it once, and then you're just going to copy it to all of your files. So it's not a problem if you don't completely understand what's going on. All that matters is that you have this once, you've seen how it's done, how it's built from scratch, and then you can use it for your other components. And then we're going to come here once we have our type, and we're going to export our first story. So we're going to do export const, and we're going to call this primary. And the reason we're going to call this primary is because we're interested in testing the variant of type primary. So primary makes sense as a name. Of course, you can name this in any way that you want. This is actually the name that is going to show up inside of Storybook, inside of the UI. So make sure that is something that makes sense for the actual story that you're testing. And then we're going to give this story as its type, right? Because this is going to be of type story. Now this is going to be equal to an object over here, and inside of this object, what we're going to do is we're going to provide it some arguments. But first, before doing that, let's see how this component behaves just by this default story without any extra configuration. So if we go back here to our Storybook UI, as you can see, we have this button over here, and let me see. Yeah, there we go. We have this button over here, right? It is hoverable. So when we click on it, it does something. We see primary over here, but the button has no text. It does have a blue background color, but the reason it has a blue background color is because here in the actual props, we're defaulting the variant to primary if it is not provided. So because we haven't provided anything here, our button is just having the default blue color. And as you can see, there's also no text inside of the button because the text inside of the button comes from children. As you can see here, we have children, and we have currently not provided anything to this component. So Storybook is working. It's showing us exactly what we configured. We just haven't configured our button to have any single props that we need for it to show up correctly. So let's fix that. Let's come back and give our button some actual props. And the way that you do that in Storybook is you use the args property. So we're going to do args like this, and we're going to give this an object. And this is going to be properly typed because, as you can see here, we can do variant, right? This is coming directly from our story props over here, which is the component props of our button. So that's why it knows that we have a variant property. And here we're just going to give it primary. Even though it is defaulted here inside of this button to primary, there's no guarantee to us that this is always going to be true. Maybe in the future, we're going to change this to secondary or something else. So having it explicit over here is going to make sure that this variant property is always going to be explicitly split in Storybook, so that we're always going to have it set. Then we're going to add also a size because our button does expect a size as well. So we're going to put this medium for now, size, and then MD. And then we're going to do another thing. And actually, we're just going to leave it for now. We're just going to do this and see how this now behaves. Now, this is actually going to have the same results because we haven't actually changed anything in what is being rendered on a screen. Our button still has a primary variant, which means it's still going to be blue, and our button still has a size of medium, which means it's going to be the same as the defaults. We haven't done anything else. That's fine. What we want to do now is we actually want to get some text to this button because it doesn't make sense for a button to not have text. Now, because our button here expects children, we're going to have to pass it some form of children for it to actually have text. Now, how do you do that? How do you pass children or anything to a component inside of Storybook? Well, the way that you do that is use a custom render function over here. So inside of this story, you can actually pass a render function like this, and that is going to be a function that takes in all of the args over here. So that is going to be the arguments, the same ones as here, and you can actually do something with it, or in our case, we can just not do anything. We cannot access any of these args, and we can just have this return a button like this. And actually, this is wrong. We do need to have args because our button, remember, expects some props over here, and those props have to come from args. So actually, we need to use the args. That was a mistake on my part. And then we're going to come here and then just spread args like this. And actually, I believe I should put this inside of quotes and then return like this, and then put this here. Let's see if this is right. Why is this giving me an error? Am I not allowed to do it this way? Aha, I figured out my error. We are working inside of a TS file, and TS file TypeScript files do not by default support JSX, right? So that's why we're getting this error. So we just have to come here and rename this to TSX like so. And now our error is going to go away because now this is valid JavaScript JSX code, right? So there we go. We have to use the args, and then we're passing the args directly to our button. Now, if I save this and go back here, we're not going to see anything because the args in and of themselves do not actually have children. So that's why we're not seeing here. What we have to do is, besides of the args here, because this is just a normal component, we have to actually call it like this. And then in here, we can actually pass whatever we want. So we can do something like test over here, right? This is our children. We're manually passing children to our button component. Now, if we do this, you're going to see that we do have test inside of our component because it's coming directly being rendered over here. We're using the args for the props over here, but because we're not having children inside of here, inside of our args, we're just having to manually pass it inside of our component. Now, of course, we could do this if you want, because this is properly typed. We could also do children like this, and then also pass test over here, and then remove it like so, and just close it here, and then remove all of this. We could also do that, and this would still work, right? We're passing children that way. So that's another way to do it. I showed you two different ways because probably you're going to want to have different options, and these are two different ways to do the same exact thing. The reason I initially showed you the first way is because oftentimes what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to customize the actual props that you're passing to each individual component and have those be customizable from over here. As you can see here, every single component also has some controls here, which you can actually change. You can actually change test over here. You can put anything that you want. This is just a normal input. You can change the variant to be secondary. Like so. Now it's going to be green, but note here that because this is a string, I can actually put something that is invalid, and that is just going to break the whole UI of my button. We're going to fix that in just a moment. And you can also change the size here. You can put large and have this button be represented as a large button. So now what I'm going to show you is actually these two things. I'm going to show you how to configure all of these controls over here, and also I'm going to show you a neat little trick that you're probably going to want to use inside of your own components as you're working with Storybook. Instead of passing children directly over here, here, we're going to have this come from the arcs, but these arcs are going to be arcs that are not part of the actual component. So it's not going to be any variant, it's not going to be any size, it's not going to be any children. We're going to create our own custom property and use that to manually create our children outside of the props of our button component. So what we're going to do is we're going to come here to our story props, and the reason why I did it this way is because now we're easily going to be able to extend this type and add our own custom props that do not come from the actual component props of our button. That's why we did it this way. So we're going to come here and we're going to do a space and we're going to do end, and here we're going to be able to give any custom prop that we want that again does not belong to the button component. For example, we're going to do button text like this, and we're going to make this be a string like so. Now this button text property again doesn't belong on the button, but is going to be part of our story, which means that we can actually have it over here. We can do button text like this, and what happened, let's put it back, and we can do something like hello like this, right? And we're going to put it here. Now, when we actually pass the args over here, we're not going to want to pass every single argument because button text, again, doesn't belong to button and it's not going to do anything to our button. So what we're going to do is we're going to come here and we're going to take button text, and then the rest, we're just going to spread them, args. And then we're going to have all of these args. Remember, all of these are valid to the button. We're going to pass those as normal to the button, but we're going to put it here instead of test. We're going to do button text like this. And now we're using the arguments, right, to actually pass some values to our component. And this is really useful when you want to do something with your actual component without using any of its props. For example, instead of having button text, we could have had number of children, which we're going to do for the stack component, and use that number to generate an arbitrary amount of actual children to use in the component. That's why you do this. And now if you go back here to our actual UI, we have button text, which has hello, and we can put anything we wanted here. How are you? Right? And this is automatically going to show up in our button. So that's step one. Step two is actually controlling how these inputs here allow you to enter values, and perhaps for the button text, because it is text, we want to leave it as is, but for the variant, we shouldn't allow to put secondary or something that is invalid. We should control what values go inside of this input to maybe allow a selection of multiple inputs that we control so that we don't allow any invalid values inside of our storybook. So the way that you do that inside of Storybook is you come here to your actual meta object, and here you're going to pass a property called arg types like this, and this is going to be an object. This is going to allow you arg types with an S. This is going to allow you to pass individual control properties, individual properties for each one of these args over here, so each one of these args, and actually configure how they're showing up in the Storybook UI over here. So for example, what we can do is we can take our variant over here. Again, this is going to be typed as well. So we have variant. This is going to be an object. And here we're going to do control. And that is going to be another object of type. And then we're going to give this here select. We're going to have this be a control of type select. This is specifying how this input is actually controllable in the Storybook UI. So that's the first step. And then if we passed it here control, we're also going to have to pass it, if we passed it here select, sorry, we're also going to have to pass it some options. So we're going to do options. That is going to be an array. And here we're going to do primary. And then we're going to do secondary. Like this, right? And now if we go back here to our actual UI, you're going to see that our primary input over here no longer is just a straight up text input. It's actually a select option, which only allows me to select primary or secondary, which again are the only values that our component expects. So now no matter what I press, I'm always going to press a prop that is valid for this component, and we're going to see the result that we want in our component. And then we can do the exact same thing with our size property. So we can come here, we can do size like this, and then we can also do an object over here. We can do options, and here we're going to leave small, medium, large, and then we're going to do the same thing, control type select. We're going to paste it here as well, and now we have the same thing for our size. It can only be small, it can only be medium, or it can only be large. And these are only values that are valid for the button component. That's why you want to do this, and you're going to use the arg types object to actually configure that. Now there's one more thing that I want to show you that is really important, and that is if you look here at our button component, we have this on click function over here. We want to actually test that this is actually being called whenever we press press the button. It doesn't matter what the function is actually going to do in and of itself, because again, we're working in an isolated environment, but we just want to make sure that when we press this button over here, this onClick is being called, right? We're using this as our testing library in a way. So we want to test that this component, not only does it have the correct styles based on its props, but if I actually pass it a onClick function, it is actually going to call that whenever I expect it to call it. And for that, you have multiple ways of doing it. The simplest way is you can come here to your button and either provide it as an args over here, but even before that, because this is just a straight up component, you can do onClick, and then here you can just do console.log and then clicked like this, right? We're just passing it as a normal prop inside of our JSX over here. Then if you come here, you're going to click it, you open up the console, you're going to see that we have clicked over here, right? Every time that I click this button, obviously, there we go. You see, we're logging in the console. That's one way to do it, but I'm going to show you a better way that is natively integrated into Storybook. So instead of doing this, we're going to undo all of this and we're going to come here. There we go. We're going to come here inside of our arg, inside of our meta object, sorry. And besides archetypes, we're actually going to provide some args here as well. So we're going to do args. This is going to be an object, and this is essentially the same object that we provide over here, just inside of the meta object. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do onClick. And here we're just going to do fn, and we're going to have to import this from, let me see where this is imported from Storybook at test. So let me just copy this over here. This is a slightly different library. It's still Storybook, just /test. We're going to import this fn function, and we're going to pass it here to the onClick as so, right? And that's the only thing that we need to do. This is then going to get piped through this story over here, through this args, and eventually to this component. And now let's see how this behaves. Let's come back here to our Storybook. Let's close our console because now we're not going to be expecting anything in there. And now whenever I click this, you're going to see that we have something pop up here in the actions. We actually have onClick that is logged over here. Every time that I press this is going to get logged over here with the actual event that it's logged with, right? Doing it this way, you're natively integrated into Storybook, and you're automatically, just by putting here, you're going to have access to this onClick function, and you're going to get it here inside of the actions, and you're going to see every single property that this logs. This is better than doing it the simple way, which is using a simple console log, right? So just put the fn function here as the args for any single property inside of your component that is clickable, and everything else is going to work. And with this, honestly, you've pretty much learned everything that there is to know about Storybook, at least the basics, and now we can use this to just create more stories, right? So let's do that quickly before we end this video to just see how we would do this for multiple stories. I'm just going to do one other story inside of this component, and then we're going to do a simple story stack for our appropriately named stack component. So here inside of button, the only thing that we want to do is maybe take all of this and then just export a new story like this, and instead of primary, we're going to call this secondary, like so. And then here we're going to do variant secondary. Let's see, there we go. If I can just type, come on, secondary, like so. And now we have the same exact thing. And now if you go here to our Storybook UI, we have two different stories. We have primary and then we have secondary. The reason why they're both the same color is because we actually, Storybook, whenever you make changes, will actually make those changes and save them in your file. We don't want to do that. We just want to reset it, right? So now we have primary and secondary, and we can visually see that our component is behaving exactly as we expect it to. Of course, we can now create one for each individual size. We can create one for a bunch of different variations. We're not going to do that. We're going to keep things simple, and we're just going to move on to our stack component. So for our stack component, we're going to come here and do the exact same thing. We're going to come inside of our stories folder. We're going to do stack.stories.tsx because we're probably going to want to use some JSX in there as well. And then just to show you that you don't actually need to quite understand and memorize all of this, we're just going to take all of this code over here and we're just going to paste it inside of our stack stories. And then for everything that is button, we're just going to replace this with stack and see where we get, right? So first we're going to import the stack component from stack. This is giving me an error. Let's see why, because this is a default export and our button is not. That's totally fine. So let's just change our import. Again, excuse me for the inconsistencies. Something got mixed up as I was doing this video, but none the matter. We're still importing our component inside of this file, right? So one component per stories file, that makes sense. And then we're creating our story props over here. The only thing is probably we're not going to need this. Actually, we will, but we're going to need a different type. So that's fine. And here we have to actually change our props because the variant is not a prop of our stack. So let's delete all of this. Let's delete all of this as well. We're probably going to want to delete this as well. And then we're going to delete all of these here. delete stack text because we're not going to need it, and we're just going to do stack like this. And actually I'm just going to leave it with errors because let's look at our stack component. This one is props with children, so it also accepts children, and then it just has an orientation prop like so. So let's deal with the orientation prop. Let's come here, let's do orientation. That is going to be control of type. And in here, you can actually see you have Boolean, you have check, you have color, date, inline check, all of these. Depending on what you want for your specific component, feel free to use any one of those and just configure them. Look at the documentation. We're just going to use the select input because that is the simplest and the one that covers our use case. And then here we're going to give it options, and that is going to be an array. And the options that we want, we're just going to copy these, horizontal and then vertical. So that's pretty self-explanatory. And this, instead of a pipe, it's going to be a comma. And there we go. We have our orientation. There we go. Now here, let's remove all of our stories. So first, let's rename this primary story because primary was because our button component had a primary actual variant property. This one doesn't, but this one has orientation, which we're going to want to make one for horizontal and one for vertical. So let's do that. We're going to call this horizontal. Like this, there we go. And we're going to have another one for vertical. This one is going to be orientation. That is going to be horizontal. There we go. And then we're just going to leave this for now. We're going to deal with this stack text over here. So this is actually what I was talking about when I said that you want to usually add extra props that are not belonging to, actually we don't need this FN, that are not belonging to the actual component to do stuff with it. If you look here, the stack component also receives children as well, and it uses those children to actually wrap with this div, right? That's how we're doing. We're basically wrapping everything with a flex row or flex column, and we're using the children to do that. So children has to be an array of different things. We don't have, I mean, we could do this simply in the archetypes, but I'm going to show you a more efficient way to actually do that. Super cool. So let's come here to our story props and let's create, as we did in the button component, some extra props over here. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to do number of children like this, and that is going to be of type number like so. We're going to use this property. Instead of passing children directly, we're just going to allow for Storybook to pass the number of children that we want, and then based off of that, we're going to create dynamically our own children over here, and we're just going to render them on the screen. This is going to be easier in terms of using Storybook as a UI than manually specifying our own children. It's easier to set 5, 10, 20 children than it is to manually specify what those children is. Are they divs? Are they text? Are they paragraphs? Whatever, right? Doing it this way is a lot simpler. Then, because we have number of children, what we're going to do is come here and add them in our archetypes. So we're going to do number of children as well. And this is also going to be a control of type select. So I'm just going to copy all of this. And here, we're just going to have it be an array of numbers. We're going to put 1, 5, and then 10. And this is also going to be a select, right? And then inside of the args over here, what we're going to do is this is also used to set values, default values of those properties. Because now this is an option of 1, 5, or 10. I think it's going to default to 1, the first one, I believe. But let's say we don't want that. We want number of children to be defaulted to 5 for every single story. We're going to be able to do that by setting it here inside of this args. This is going to apply to every single story inside of this file. We could also put it here inside of this args, whereas this is going to only apply for this one. But we want both of our stories, horizontal and vertical, to have 5 initially number of children. And then we're going to come here and we're going to do the exact same thing. Number of children, we're going to access it directly. And then we're going to use the number of children to basically create all of our children. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a handy helper function here that I have to just make our lives a little bit easier to not have to repeat myself. It's just a simple function that is going to create children. It takes in a number of children of type number, exactly what we have over here. And based off of that, it just creates an array, fills it with null, maps over it. We only care about the index, and then just renders a div with 100 and height 100 and a background color of red so that we can visually see it on the screen. That's all that it does. Then we're going to come here and instead of stack text, we're going to do create children. We're going to pass a number of children, and there we go, right? We used number of children. Again, this was a prop that did not belong part of the stack component. We're using it here. We're having it be controllable 1, 5, or 10. And then based off of that, we're setting it to 5. And then based off of that, we're using it inside of our own custom function to actually render out some UI, some boxes over here for our individual children. This makes a lot of sense, and this is how you're supposed to use Storybook. So now if we go back here to our actual UI, let me see it over here. We have the stack component and we have horizontal, and as you can see, number of children is defaulted to 5. I can come here, I can put 1 and see how this looks like with just 1 child, and I can put 10 and see how this looks like with 10 children, right? And then we can come here, we can come back to our VS Code, take all of this story over here. This really goes to show you how easy it is to just create new stories. We create a new one, we do here vertical like this, and now we have a new story. It's rendering the same thing, it's using the same create children function, right, which is why we did it. We're not going to repeat ourselves. And now we have here another vertical story that shows us our stack in vertical, right? And again, I can put this to 1, I can put this to 5, I can put this to 10, and I can see how my component behaves with all of these different properties, right? That is how you're supposed to use Storybook, and that is what you want to use Storybook for. And the last thing that I want to show you, because you stuck around this far into the video, first of all, good job, and I really appreciate it, and I hope that you're learning a lot, is how to actually get automatic documentation for each of your components for anyone in your team to see, even if they're not developers. The only thing that you have to do is first, let's come here to our stack component. Inside of this meta over here, we can actually add some tags. This is a property, and we can do here auto docs like so. This is a pre-built tag that already exists. This should be tags with an S. This is a tag that already exists in Storybook, and if you provide this, Storybook is automatically going to generate documentation for your story. So now we save this, we go back here to Storybook, we see that inside of our stack we have docs over here, and this is our component. This is how it looks like. We have a prop here, number of children, its number, we have 5, 1, and 10, right? There we go. The reason we have this here is because, again, this is coming from this type over here, otherwise it wouldn't show up. And then we have orientation, and we can even change this. I can change this to vertical, right? It's going to change the layout. I can change it to horizontal. It's going to change the layout, and I can see all of the stories that I have currently set up for this actual component. We have our horizontal story and our vertical story, and you see that was simple as adding a simple property to our meta object. And then to get the same thing to the button, we're going to copy this, come back here to our button, go here at the top, and then add auto docs. And I'll go back here, and we have the same thing for our button component. We have on click, button text, variant size, and we have all of these properties, and again our individual stories, primary and secondary, for our button component. And there you go. Honestly, with this, you now know how to use Storybook, you know how to set it up, you know how to create a basic story and customize it to your heart's content. And now you can take this, again, you're going to be able to find this exact code, this repository in the description. You can take this, build upon it, or even add Storybook to your project and start working with the actual stories. And if you get stuck, if you want to add some further customization, go and look at the Storybook documentation. You have all of the documentation over here. You have the API, you have some tutorials if you want, which are really useful, and you're going to have everything that you need to actually set up and run Storybook in your project, in your team, or wherever you find some use for this super amazing workshop tool. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more tutorials just like this one, make sure to leave this video a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.